You're listening to episode 156 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Mirabai Bush speaks with us about the Center for Contemplative Mind in Society. The ideas and practices of Buddhism are finding new ways of expression in today's society. We see mindfulness, for example, in therapeutic contexts and in the workplace, contributing to the betterment of our culture and the world. Few people have been so instrumental in this progress than today's guest. Mirabai Bush has organized, facilitated, and taught workshops, weekends, and courses on spirit and action for more than 20 years. She has a special interest in the uncovering and recovery of women's spiritual wisdom to inform work for social change. Her spiritual studies include meditation study at the Burmese Vihara in Bodh Gaya, India, Bhakti Yoga, and studies with Tibetan Lamas. Before entering the Foundation world, Mirabai was the first professional woman to work on the Saturn-Apollo moon flight at Cape Canaveral. She has also worked on educational programs with inner-city youth of color. Mirabai was a co-founder of the Center for Contemplative Mind in Society and served as executive director until 2008. Under her direction, the center developed its programs in education, law, business, and activism, and its network of thousands of people integrating contemplative practice and perspective into their lives and work. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice lemon twist tea. And our guest today is Mirabai Bush. Mirabai, thanks for being here.
I'm happy to be here.
You are the Senior Fellow and Associate Director and actually co-founder of the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, and we'll be talking about that in a little bit. But I'd like to start by having you tell us about your background, which is very rich and diverse. So I'm pulling up my chair to listen to this one in particular.
Well, I'll focus on the, on the Buddhist pathway through it. In 1970, I was a PhD student at SUNY Buffalo studying literature, and I really I didn't know anything about Buddhism, really. I'd never meditated. Allen Ginsberg had come one time, and I sat and ommed with him, and that was about it. And some friends, actually, had gone to India and returned, and they had been with Kalu Rinpoche, great Tibetan teacher there, and they brought back a tanka. And I remember looking at that tanka and just thinking that it would be important to connect with people who understand what was happening in this image, because I had begun to see that that is the way that the world was structured and organized. So I went to India with the person who was then my partner, boyfriend then, and we traveled overland and into India. And we were really not in search of Buddhism, but really I'd been in graduate school from 67 to 70, which were very just wild, I would say, years on campus, with civil rights and anti-war and psychedelics and so on. So I really was looking to find some wisdom about what we were really doing here on this planet. And we traveled through Europe and the Middle East and met many people along the way. And then ended in India, and I expected to stay there for a couple of weeks. It would be another place that I would be exploring, like Turkey or Afghanistan or Pakistan. And the first day I was there, I met Sharon Salzberg on the street. And yeah, and many of you probably know Sharon is a Vipassana teacher now, and a great one. And we had been at the same university, but we didn't know each other there, but we had heard of each other. And we met, and she said, well, there's a retreat for Westerners, the first, that's what we were called in India, the first one ever to be offered by a Buddhist teacher, and it's in Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha had been enlightened. And it's a 10-day retreat. And to me, it sounded just like, well, we're in India. That's probably what you should do in India. It wasn't. She had gone there wanting to learn to meditate, but I really hadn't. I was just kind of searching in general. So we went to this retreat, and it was being taught by Goenka, and it was the first course he had ever taught for Westerners, and about 100 Westerners, Europeans and North Americans, had heard about it, probably mostly in the same way that I heard, and we all showed up there. And as it turned out, there were many people in that very first course who came out of that, and after staying in India for some time, as I did, became the beginnings of the kind of Buddhist awakening in this country. Joseph Goldstein and Sharon Salzberg were both there, and Wes Nisker, and Ram Dass was there, and quite a number of people who were close to him. It was really a wonderful time, and we did this 10-day course. I had never sat before, and I was so moved by the experience of meditation and how the essential questions that I didn't even know had answers, everything became, not in some miraculous way, but slowly I began to see the basics, and I loved it. And after the first course, everybody had been there, about 100 people. We all wanted to do more. So we did another course and another, and we all stayed there for a few months. One course we did under the Bodhi tree. It was a time in Bodh Gaya when there was, we were the only Westerners there. And the Tibetan teachers it wasn't so long after the first Tibetans had left Tibet. So Lama Geshe and Lama Zopa were there. They were the first Tibetan teachers to be teaching Westerners in Bodh Gaya. And it was a pretty wonderful experience. We stayed, we did all the sitting, we hung out with other teachers there. And then after that, I stayed in India for about 2 years, and I studied with other teachers as well. And I was with my root teacher, was Neem Karoli Baba, who was Ram Dass's teacher. I spent a long time with him. And when I came back to this country, I was so moved by the kind of way of being that I had discovered from these practices that I really wanted to do something here that it wasn't even like I wanted to introduce it to other people, but I wanted to live a life and create an environment that would be informed by Buddhist wisdom. And when I first came back with my partner, then we started a business, which is why I've always been interested in how these practices can influence the way we are in organizations. And we started a business called Illuminations. And we were hippies, we were young, we were, it was all, and we were traveling everywhere with Ram Dass, and so we wanted to we wanted to express the common, universal place of wisdom that existed in all the different spiritual traditions we had encountered as we had traveled. We put out these mandalas from all the different traditions, and we sold them in health food stores and spiritual bookstores, and people bought them for, originally they were $1, and they put them on their car windows. And it started out as this really small, funky thing that we did. After some time, it turned into a kind of big, small business. So this thing turned from just being something we traded in health food stores for peanut butter into, kind of, we had 100 people working. We were in 10,000 stores. It was an organization, and it had to be managed and led, and we did it. We wanted to do it on principles of right livelihood, and it was very successful. In fact, it's 35 years ago, and many people who were on staff there still feel it was this big turning point in their lives. And there's a Facebook site for, former employees of Illuminations, and they have annual gatherings in which people get together and, share what they're doing now and what they had learned at that time. So it was quite wonderful, and it moved me to appreciate that I had done this instead of choosing to teach or to start a retreat center, because I had a child when I came back to America, and in those days there wasn't much space for families in retreat centers. So I felt like we needed to learn how to lead a dharmic life and be in the world. I always felt that whatever I was doing was about that it was not so much running a business, but it was like discovering how business can be right livelihood. After that, I worked with some other friends who I'd also been in India with, and we founded the Seva Foundation. I won't talk too much about it, but there we were really looking at how compassionate action could work in the world in a way so that one could also be really effective. And we formed Seva Foundation, and we focused on blindness originally in Asia, and since that time we have given sight back to more than 3 million people who otherwise would be blind.
That's amazing.
In Asia, for free. For them. It was an amazing organization, and it was the same thing. We just tried to see how service and compassionate action could work in the world, and it did. It was pretty wonderful. Ram Dass was on that board, and the Grateful Dead was our house band, and we had a lot of fun doing it. We raised a lot of money through concerts and rock and roll. It was great. And but then we also had epidemiologists and all kinds of scientists and doctors on the technical side, and then out of that, one of the things we did there was, out of the 60s, there was this sense that people either became political activists if they were holding the vision of that time. You either became a political activist and very secular, or you became spiritual, and then you left all that behind. And that was quite true for many years, but we felt in Seva that we were really working to embody both. And so we started giving a series of retreats, first for social activists, and that led me to start the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. And the mission there was to introduce contemplative practices, we called it, which was the whole range from Buddhist meditation practices, including Christian walking the labyrinth, many practices, Tai Chi, Qigong, contemplative listening, writing, reading, and so on, to introduce them into secular settings to help people integrate another way of being and knowing into the work they were doing in the world. And that's what I've been doing for the last 15 years.
And that's an important part of your work, and this is said right on the main page of the site, is that you envision higher education as an opportunity to cultivate deep personal and social awareness, that it's not just about individual practice in meditation, it's about taking it out into the world. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because I was an activist before I learned to meditate. I was an anti-war activist and civil rights activist, and so I when I first sat, I got this glimpse of the interconnection of all life, and I got a glimpse of we all suffer and we all want to be free from suffering and we want to be happy and we're interconnected. So to me, it seemed like, I guess anybody who meditates is going to want to relieve the suffering of others. But, I learned that there may be that emerging desire, but that not everybody really kind of sees it that way. And so I worked for some time with Ram Dass, and then I wrote a book with him called Compassion and Action about getting started in service and action in order to relieve suffering in the world. And then when I started the center, what I began to see, I started it with the heads of two foundations, and they had just funded a series by Bill Moyers called Healing in the Mind. And this was like in the early 90s. And at that time, what he revealed in this show or series was that Americans were spending, billions of dollars on what we now call complementary or alternative medicine. But basically, it was mindfulness practice and a whole series of related practices. So he revealed that was going on in health and healing, and he interviewed John Kabat-Zinn and others in that field. We started asking if these practices could be beneficial in other sectors of American life other than health and healing. For me, it was a rhetorical question, but for others, I think it was a real question. And we brought together anybody we knew who was looking at those issues. And so, we had people like Bob Thurman, because he was teaching at Columbia then, I think, in Buddhism, and I think Joan Halifax, because she'd done some work in prisons, and Stephen Rockefeller, who had been teaching meditation at Middlebury, and so on. There were just people who kind of touched on it, but it wasn't like the core of what they were doing. For a couple of years, we had these meetings at which we, said, what do you think, what could happen in these different areas if we introduce this? Danny Goleman was part of it, because he had just written Emotional Intelligence. And so after a while, it was clear that it was time to try it out. And so what the center did was we found people in business, law, environment, journalism, and higher education and other fields. And we worked with them to do a whole series of basically retreats or introductions into the workplace, whatever we felt was called for. We always said we were secular, and we did at some of our retreats have representatives from different traditions. We'd have, like, Brother David Stendel-Rast would introduce them, Christian practices, or Father Thomas Keating, who does centering prayer. But the core of most of the retreats and programs was basic Buddhist practice, what Joseph Goldstein taught. We did a series of retreats for Yale law students and faculty that Joseph led. Stephen Smith led business retreats, and Norman Fisher led law retreats. And they were amazing. And what we discovered was that in each field, and this is all still pretty early, so now all of these areas, there's emerging movement in each of these areas. But this was the very beginning. And we found in each place that people they had very few opportunities to talk about and look at the questions they had about. Often they were questions of morals and ethics, but also looking at their original motivation for going into these professional fields, asking questions, in law, what is the relationship between justice and law and truth? Asking questions like, can I be a zealous advocate and still have compassion for the person on the other side of the case? In every field, there were questions essential to that field, but that would arise once they began looking at their own minds and allowing themselves to engage questions of the kind of heart or basis of their professional commitment.
Yeah, you created an opportunity for them to explore those that probably hadn't existed before.
Exactly. I mean, I didn't need to know the issues in law at all going in. We had to just create a space, just like you said.
Mm-hmm.
And then it all emerged. It's very beautiful. Really amazing. I mean, I just learned so much during those years.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you had these very different disciplines, all with that shared human question about how do we relate compassionately with one another in these professions as we look at different ways of right livelihood, for example.
Yeah.
And social change. How do we take it off the cushion? And how does it find resonance in this society?
Yeah. And we also worked a lot with social justice advocates or activists. And that was a wonderful program. A lot of people working up against intractable issues are so discouraged and really need ways to sustain themselves.
Yeah.
And to increase their resilience. We also did a program with the Army, with chaplains, with caregivers in the Army.
Wonderful. Well, let's talk a little bit about the programs that you have available today.
It evolved so that some programs spun off and became independent. I stepped down in 2008 or 9 as director and became a senior fellow. And then we've had a series of directors since then, and with that, it's evolved into focusing mainly on higher education. We helped Google develop this whole big program, Search Inside Yourself, which you know about, and that was and still is a great joy. And that's one of the few programs that remains. It's not officially higher education, but I always say Google is such an extension of the Stanford campus.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it might as well be higher education. And that was a really wonderful program that is the first mindfulness-based emotional intelligence program. There's now a book about it called the moment we named that course was really great. Like in every area, you use the language of whoever's there. But Google, because they're the big search engine, what shall we call it? Search inside yourself.
There we go. That's it.
Isn't that great? And I told them, their mission is to make all the information in the world available easily and cheaply to everybody in the world. So I said, I think they really like this because they're worried that the external information is going to give out, and they recognize that once you start searching inside yourself, there's no end. So,
we are wonderfully complex creatures that can be investigated and examined and searched
forever. So our main program now is in higher education, and it's been amazing. We have over 150 fellows around the country. They're in every discipline in higher education and in every kind of school, from Ivies to state universities to historically black schools, the whole range. Mainly, I think now the higher education, which I started out thinking was the last place to make deep social change, it is the place where young people go during those years when they are searching for and discovering their sense of meaning in the world. The American university had gotten had not been satisfying students' search for meaning. These professors have integrated practice into their classes, and into their discipline. Our director now of the center, Dan Barbizet, he's an economist. He teaches at Amherst, and he's a practitioner. He does Vipassana practice, and he was trying to kind of bring together his practice and his teaching in economics and try to figure out how that all works together when he had an aha insight that at the heart of every economic decision is desire. There's always a wanting. Without the wanting, you don't make a decision for economic change. So what he did with his students was he taught them basic practice, and he taught them to see desire, arising and falling away. They looked at the impermanent nature of desire. And then he had them go into the mall and walk through and notice the sensations in their body as they were drawn toward things that they desired, and then notice those arising and falling away. I mean, I thought it was brilliant because I've always thought economics was something that somebody else would take care of, that it wasn't really one of those things that I could understand. Then here we were, in the middle of an economic crash. And why did that happen? Yeah, greed and also delusion, I mean, Alan Greenspan said, I made a mistake. He said, I thought people would always, the basic economic principle, people will act in their own self-interest. What this course helps them understand is that if you don't know your own mind, you don't know yourself, you don't know what's in your self-interest. And you don't much less understand the no-self and the interconnection of everything. And that if you're not acting in the interest of all beings, that there's a way in which you are acting against your self-interest. So, I mean, those are deep questions around economics that I just loved, that would not have been asked without a contemplative dimension in the classroom.
Yeah.
So that's what we're doing, and we're encouraging people to do that. And we have a national association, and we have annual conferences. Last year, 65 people presented their work, and we have a summer session every summer that the professors from across the country come to learn how to do this work. And we have a retreat every year so people can deepen their own practice. And that's the heart of it.
So I see there are many resources, and I have to say to people when I give you the website address on this, do check it out, because there's some really terrific resources on the site itself, not just in terms of the work they're doing, but to help support your practice.
Yeah, strictly secular, in the world practice.
So Mirabai, as you look over the past number of years in working with the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, what are some of the biggest challenges that you faced as an organization, and what are some of the things that you've done to help address these?
Of course, for any nonprofit, a huge challenge is getting funded to do the work. And 15 years ago, the idea of raising money, we were $1 million a year organization. Our budget's a little less than that now. When I started thinking, oh my God, $1 million a year for meditation, this is crazy.
For this ancient free practice.
Yeah, well, exactly. I remember one time Meng at Google said to me, and we're going, after we developed the whole curriculum, he said, and we're going to make it open source because we're Google,
Mm-hmm.
And I said, and it's true that it is a curriculum. We did develop it in certain ways, and we did add mindful emailing and things like that. But still, I said, Meng, these practices have been open source for 2,500 years. You know? But yeah, I mean, so I found that what we had to do was to really look deeply into the practices and really learn how to express what they do in terms of basic, ordinary, human terms. And we often said these are human practices that, you know, that we've lost touch with, and that if we come back into more self-awareness and awareness of others, it can lead to, and then we look at all these possible social, you know, changes. I mean, tonight before you called, I was sitting and watching this news about all these hearings on gun control today. It's horrible. You know, I worked last year with a fabulous Buddhist teacher named George Mumford. He was the guy who taught these. He'd be a great interview.
Stephen Batchelor has already suggested George. He's on my list.
So he taught the Chicago Bulls and the L.A. Lakers meditation.
Yep.
And so I got a call from this group in Chicago. There was a movie made about them last year called The Interrupters. They're a group called Ceasefire, and they're ex-gang members who are working on the streets in Chicago to try to reduce the violence. And, of course, they've all been in prison. They've all killed people. And now they're back, and they're trying to make a difference. And George and I got this call out of the blue, and I called George, and we went out there and worked with them. And, you know, they, of course, were all burned out. And it was so, it's a long story, but they were so amazing. They were so beautiful. And George was the perfect teacher for them. And they responded so incredibly. I mean, here were these people who, you know, they'd done all the bad things, but they were just like everybody. They wanted to be happy. They didn't want to suffer. They didn't want to cause suffering. They wanted to relieve suffering. And their lives hadn't, showed them many ways to do that. And now they had this opportunity. But it was so hard for them because they were just on the street 24/7 and exhausted. And so George taught them some basic practice. It was beautiful.
You know, it's funny you bring that up, Mirabai, because I just finished watching the Dhamma.
Oh,
Brothers.
yeah, Dhamma Brothers, yeah.
I did an interview with Jenny Phillips, who's the filmmaker of that, just last week, and so that will be released sometime around when this one is as well. And it's the same thing. We see this practice that, and I keep repeating this on the podcast, so regular listeners are getting tired of hearing me say, this is a human practice. You don't have to be Buddhist to do this for anyone.
Yeah, you know, just today I got my first copy of Mindful. Do you know that Shambhala Sons brought out this new magazine called Mindful?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And it's about, you know, mindfulness in the secular world. And so back last year when they were working on the idea, Barry Boyce, who's the head of it, was there. I was at a meeting with him and Michael Kraft, who's the program director for Omega. So we were talking, and Barry was talking about how he's bringing out this new magazine named Mindful. And he's saying, well, what do you think about the name, you know? And I said, well, you know, I've been calling these practices human practices these days. So basically I was saying I think it's great you're getting out into the mainstream. And Michael said, why don't you call the magazine Human? It's great. I don't think that would quite work.
And would be accurate.
But yeah, talk to George. He's so wonderful.
I've
that
with him as well.
Yeah, but you know, some of the work we did with social justice activists, which is what allowed me to do this thing in Chicago, is so deep and so amazing. It's a hard world. There's a lot of suffering. I really feel that these practices and these environments that we've created and that can be created so simply. It doesn't cost much money to sit down together and to remember who we are and, what we care about.
So, Mirabai, let's talk for a minute then about, you've discussed some of the challenges that you've faced, and I was wondering if you'd talk for a few minutes now about some of the wonderful things that you've seen come out of the work of the center.
Oh, well,
I know, long
so
list.
So much. Yeah, so much. But there's now a movement in the country of mindfulness among lawyers and judges. We had a group of judges come to us at one point and say, some of whom had, done some mindfulness practice, said, could you do a special workshop where you teach us to be non-judgmental? Yeah, that's great. What they said was that, they're totally overworked, and one after another, these people come and stand before them. And it is so difficult not to prejudge them based on what they look like, what the person before them had done, and so on. Think about that. That's a wonderful contribution if that can spread. So the law program is really amazing. I'm very enthusiastic about this course that we did with Google, because those guys out there in Silicon Valley and around the country, in big ways, they're conditioning our consciousness and our awareness for the future. Not only is it better if we can teach them ways to, be more aware and self-aware, but I think that the products that they create come out of that awareness, and we depend on them because we don't all know how to write algorithms. Giving support and teaching practice to social justice activists, they're doing the hard work on the ground, from everything from environment to, prison rights to killing on the streets. They need resilience, and they need to understand how to sustain themselves. And that's been really great work. It all comes down to the same thing, whoever we are. At the center, institutionally, I had to look at it by, professions and sectors. It's making a big difference, and it's making a big difference on the margins right now, but it could make a huge difference in our culture, to bring in a culture. Do you remember that when Obama said, when he was appointing his first Supreme Court judge, said he wanted a judge with empathy, and he got completely dumped on. There could be a time when it's acknowledged that is not only empathy but compassion is a critical factor for being a Supreme Court judge. Anyhow, you can tell I could go on. I could rant. But, it's all, and higher education, thousands of students are going through there. We need to let them know that there's a way to, be in their lives that is kinder, more compassionate, more wise than what they're learning just from critical thinking, which we don't disparage at all, but they need a complement for it.
Yeah, that clear discernment and how we think is certainly an extremely beneficial skills. And I've had Dr. Linda Elder from the Center for Critical Thinking here on the podcast as well, one of the very first episodes actually, and we need to, of course, temper that with the compassion of direct human experience. We're social creatures. We don't live in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Mirabai, was there anything else that you wanted us to talk about before we break?
No, except that what I've been doing is, because I've been involved in all these institutions and organizations, I'm really interested in how we, how we can bring practice and awareness into our everyday work at whatever it is we're doing. And I recently recorded a CD called Working with Mindfulness, which just has simple, basic practice on it. But it's I talk about it in the context of working. And that I just think that's important. So
that is, in fact, I have a link for that. I've already gotten the link for that in preparation for this, and we'll be using that with your episode. So folks listening, go to the website. You can find that there, along with several of the books that we've mentioned that Mirabai was part of putting out. And again, a couple of addresses for folks who are listening is first for the center itself, which is www.contemplativemind.org, and then for Mirabai herself, her own website, www.mirabaibush.com, and there's a link on that in the episode page, but to spell it for you, it's mirabaibush.com. Mirabai, thank you so much for being here. This has been a wonderful conversation.
This was really fun. I really enjoyed talking to you tonight. So thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.